Hey everyone, I think we're going to start because we have 1 hour and we have a lot to discuss about this relationship between migration and climate change. First of all, let me welcome everyone and thank you for being here. It's great to see the room full of people, and it's, up to now we have 75 people online, so there's a lot of people joining and a lot of interest on this fantastic topic. This seminar is part of I guess, a longer run series on climate change in general in audit, and of course, this for this particular academic term, we are going to focus on the link between migration and climate change, and I will explain the context of that in a minute. But something very interesting also with this particular event, which I'm very excited about, is that it's actually a collaboration. It's a co-sponsorship between the University of Oxford and UCLA, and hopefully it's the first of many collaborations on this topic as we move forward. And as part of that, we're very excited to have Abel Valenzuela, who is the Dean of Social Sciences at UCLA. And before we start the event, I wanted to get Abel, say a few words maybe about this potential collaboration and Oxford and UCLA.
Thank you, Carlos. So I was asked to give welcoming comments, and it's a bit odd because this is the second time I've been to Oxford, but I will try my best. I do send greetings from the provost and the executive vice chancellor of UCLA, and the reason he in particular sends greetings is because he was the former dean of social sciences. And so when I shared with him this project that I've been working on with Raul, he was quite pleased, and he said, "You make sure you give my greetings." And of course, he also provides resources in terms of support. Let me begin by thanking Carlos Vargas Silva, the Center for Migration Policy and Society, in part for hosting, and also the Department of International Development. Thank you for being kind and generous hosts in this space. I've been engaging the social sciences to have a more central space in environmental degradation. And the reason being is that in the social sciences, we have particular strengths in a few key areas at UCLA, in particular with regards to frontline communities, indigenous communities, and we also do a pretty good job studying inequality across 18 different departments and divisions. And so trying to position our work more central to environmental and climate change is one of my top priorities. And in this process, I've engaged with different colleagues and faculty, not only at UCLA, but globally. And so I believe today's presentation is one such example of the work that I'm trying to support in the division. And just to dovetail on what Carlos said, this is part of a larger effort to bring in resources so that we can do this on a regular basis, not just in Oxford in the United Kingdom, but also in the States, back at home at UCLA. And so the idea is that we generate resources that allow us to do these conferences and perhaps offer scholarships and other sorts of resources that might populate a space like this, or perhaps we can do this online. So thank you for coming, and I'm very much looking forward to the presentation.
Thank you, Abel. That's fantastic. So before we start with our speakers and introduce our main speakers for today, I wanted to give a bit of the concept and the idea, the setting of why are we doing this particular event. Part of the idea is that if you look at the research on migration and climate change, there's a lot of research about numbers, potential impact of climate change on numbers of migrants. And some of those methodologies and estimates are incredible than others, so there are plenty of those, plenty of interest on that. There's plenty of interest on the protection that perhaps these people should have, right, within the legal international refugee system, and how they should be included. And I think that those topics are excellent topics for research. I encourage everyone to do research on that. But I think one thing that we should put more emphasis is to see it from a different perspective, to see how migrants, and not only people who are displaced by climate conditions, but just diasporas in general, migrants, how they can be agents of change in this climate change discussion. Where can they have a big role when we start talking about climate change, both in countries of origin and countries of destination? And I think that's what we want to focus on today, on that impact that these migrants can have on climate change, looking at it from this different perspective, from their perspective, the impact that they can have. And just to start the discussion, I wanted to give a few examples. I mean, one that always calls my attention a lot is the possibility of having what we call green diaspora bonds. A diaspora bond is a bond that is marketed, right, to the diaspora of a country, and typically there's some kind of patriotic duty related to these bonds. So diasporas are willing to, to buy a bond that might not have the same return than a regular bond because they have a patriotic duty. But there's also green bonds, and we have that discussion about green bonds, right? That are bonds that are targeted these environmental or climate change issues. Can we combine those two and have a big investment in green diaspora bonds? That was just one example of the many possibilities that we can have. I wanted to do a few other examples. We can have green diaspora investments, and some of these things are happening already. So we are not making this up. I mean, these are things that are occurring at the moment. For instance, this is just an example of such initiative for green jobs in Ghana, right? And this is happening at the moment. Target at the diaspora, invest in small businesses in Ghana. This is one about knowledge exchange. It might not be about money only, right? We can transfer knowledge and expertise for the diaspora, like in this case in the Philippines, in order to address things related to climate change. We can have, and there's a big role, I think, for academia, right? We can have academics playing a big role in this example, for the case of Mexico, of academics actually getting engaged into this discussion. I could give up, giving a lot of examples about this, but actually I have two experts here with me. So I want them to give examples rather than me leading the conversation. So let me introduce the two experts that are going to be sharing this information with us. And first, I want to introduce Professor Raul Hinojosa, who is coming for us also from UCLA. And it is in the Cesar Chavez Department of Chicana Studies and Central American Studies. For those of you who are not familiar with this concept, a Chicano is a Mexican in the United States, right? Somebody of Mexican ancestry in the United States, and I guess it has something of pride on that identity, right? To call it a Chicano. He's the founding director of the North American Integration and Development Center. He was one of the originators of the idea to have a North American Development Bank, which is a $3 billion US institution created by Mexico and US governments in 1994 in the context of NAFTA. Maybe we can talk about that later. He has published, an immense number of articles and books. But recently, and the most recent one is an interesting one. We're not going to talk about this, but it will be interesting to do another seminar on just that, which is the Trump paradox: migration, trade, and racial politics in US-Mexico integration. And as we go into the discussion, you will see why Raul has a lot to contribute and the initiatives that he's taking that are very important in this space of migration and climate change. Our second speaker, Yvonne Su, is an assistant professor in the Department of Equity Studies at York in Canada. She has been exploring this topic, this connection between migration and climate change for many years. And in fact, I recently discovered a video on YouTube in which she explains. You never want that. It's a fantastic video, and I will encourage you to explore the unequal consequences of climate forced migration. I think summarizes her research agenda. I think the political issue very well, so it's an excellent one. But the thing that really makes, I think, Yvonne special is that she's an alumni of Audit. She did the master's degree here in forced migration, refugee and forced migration studies. So it's great to have somebody back with us. For those of you who are students, well, maybe in 11 years, you will be the one giving a job. We're going to start the discussion. In fact, I'm going to stop sharing 1 second the screen so people online can. It would be impossible to hit OK, but yeah, we can learn more. Isabel will try to hit OK while we start the discussion. We want to discuss this, and we want to also leave enough time at the end for questions. And we want this to be an interactive, activity in which I know people around here, some of you are working in these topics, some of you may have ideas, right, to contribute to that. So at the end, we are going to leave a lot of time for Q&A. But first, I wanted to give an opportunity to our speakers to tell us how in the research and activities they are dealing with this issue of migration and climate change, and particularly with migrants being agents of change. Perhaps, Yvonne, I can start with you. And of course, there's a lot of discussion, as I was mentioning, about migration and climate change. I guess less emphasis on this idea of migrant being agents of change. But you can tell us, because you're an expert on this area, why you think that's the case. But perhaps from your own research, you have done a lot of research around this. Can you give us a few examples of how diasporas have become involved in your research on climate change related issues?
That's great. Thanks for the question, Carlos. So to begin, the reason why we don't talk about or research as much the role of the diaspora in contributing to climate change adaptation or mitigation is because we've only recently come to a consensus that climate migrants exist. And there's still some of you in here being, oh, because I get it, it's quite theoretically different than practice. And it's actually very poetic that we're back here in this room where I studied in 2011. I have in my calendar October 4th, Introduction Day, meet Roger Zetter, my supervisor. And then 16 days later, the UK Foresight Report comes out and says climate migration doesn't exist. Climate refugees don't exist. You suck. Don't do this research. I'm kidding. But essentially, they said they've looked at the literature, and because migration is not monocausal, it's multicausal, you cannot say that climate change creates a refugee or creates a displacement, right? But all of us now, every one of us in this room has probably been touched by some aspect of climate change, exacerbating a disaster. Your rivers are flooded right now in Oxford. Everybody in Canada, New York, even LA has probably inhaled wildfire smoke. There are hundreds of wildfires that were burned out of control in Canada last summer, and wildfire season is already starting again in Canada. And we know there are people who are displaced as a result of typhoons, of droughts, etc. And we know that climate change plays a role. So we finally gotten to a point where we can say that climate change is bad enough that has contributed to displacements. So I think that's why we haven't really talked about it. And the reason we do need to talk about it, the reason people are interested in how the diaspora can play a role in these green bonds, green remittances, that's the sexy term, guys, is because there is a glaring gap in adaptation funding. So economic and non-economic loss and damage in developing countries are expected to be $400 billion a year. 400 billion a year. So far, wealthy countries have pledged 700 million. So I don't know if there are any math whizzes here, but that's 0.2% of what is being asked as the loss and damage every year. So where are they looking? They're looking at the climate migrants and those displaced themselves for funding. And I get it, because in 2023, $660 billion was sent in remittances to low and middle income countries. That is a lot of money. That's a lot of money. And people want to utilize that for climate change. But the important thing to remember, and the difference between my research and Raul's research is I'm more micro and he's more macro. So it's important to remind everyone that remittances are still largely to individual households, right? Some of you are actually probably remittance senders here, or you're remittance receivers because somebody has to fund your education, right? So those are just paychecks or monthly paychecks, one of them. So we have to be careful not to, let's say the SDGs, right? Put that in the backs of migrants to say that, green remittances can contribute to SDGs. But I do have some examples of individual and collective remittances that are contributing to climate adaptation back home. So my research looks at Typhoon Haiyan. That was in 2013, one of the largest super typhoons ever recorded, devastated the Tacloban in the Philippines. And I found that households, not only did they send remittances right after disasters got that contributed a lot to getting medicine, baby clothes, food, water, shelter, all that stuff immediately after, but some of them were quite strategic. They would save money and send that money, say 6 months or 1 year after, to help with the strategic reconstruction of their homes so it's more resilient. So households who may have wooden houses before, they would now have concrete houses because the remittance senders could save perhaps among the relatives so that they don't have to be as affected the next disaster. Another thing is building second floors. So Typhoon Haiyan caused a storm surge that was really high and it flooded and impacted about 90% of the buildings in Taiwan. A lot of people, when I went down there and talked to survivors, they would tell harrowing stories of being on top of their roofs or hanging on telephone poles or like just running for their lives. So something the diaspora, the remittance centers did was that they sent funds to build second floors. That made a lot of sense. The major downside though, and this is the importance of social remittances, which are the ideas, right? The beliefs and the norms that are transferred among the diaspora, is that you need to build second floors in a way that it's actually going to be like cohesive and it's going to stay. So what I noticed was a lot of half-built second floors. So you can tell half of it is built with proper material, proper wood, proper engineering, and then the other half is tarps. The other half is scrap metal. These same things are going to fly off a roof in the next typhoon and kill somebody, right? So this is important, especially as many of you are starting to study this, is that we cannot say, and we should not say that all green remittances are going to contribute to good. All these investments are going to be positive. We need to make sure that we understand the downsides of it too. Because to a certain extent, arguably, it's the Build Back Better agenda. It's this pressure from the West, right, that is contributing to these second floors being built. Maybe there could have been alternative plans or just evacuation or other things that could have been done, but these bad second floors got prioritized. And again, they put people in danger as a result. And I'll just finish at the community level, give you some examples. After Typhoon Haiyan, people came together. Collective remittances were used to buy generators, right? Because not every household needs a generator. So you would buy one and people would share. People bought food and sent food and clothes from the diaspora on those fucking buy-in boxes. Church groups, relatives, they would fundraise and send community-based needs. So they're not just household needs. And other forms of collective remittances, you're going to see people fund local community cleanups to clean up the drainage system that also contributes to flooding, ways to improve the flooding infrastructure, to build seawalls. There's also investments in other parts of the world on renewable energy, solar panels in the community hall, so that if disaster strikes, we know that the community hall is going to have electricity. But most of this research has been focused on infrastructure and investment in physical capital. So anybody who wants to do this should be looking at what Carlos has put up before, which is, is going to be social or cultural capital, human capital, knowledge, right? But also natural capital, such as mangrove forests and whatnot. So there are many examples of remittances that we can study, but we just need to be critical of them.
Perfect, thank you. I mean, what you're saying, this idea of remittances responding to disasters, remind me of the research that was conducted after the Sri Lanka tsunami. And interestingly, money was very difficult to get money in many areas of the country. But the idea that you have somebody, abroad was enough for people to be calm, right? And think that, the money is going to show up at some point. So you can use it almost as credit, right? To have a diaspora family member. So in some ways, you don't even need to receive the money right away. If there's a disaster, just the knowledge that money is coming at some point can make a big difference. So I think it's but I do agree with your point that, there are pros and cons, and we need to look at the whole picture. Raul, so let me bring you to the discussion. I'm sure you will have a lot to respond to, Yvonne, and examples that part of the idea of combining the two of you, right? You have some different perspectives in all of this. Can I ask you, Yvonne called you a macro person. I think you're a person that likes to amplify impact and have bigger impacts. So how can we amplify the role of diasporas in helping communities deal with issues related to climate change? In particular, you have been playing a central role in other ideas, such as the North American Development Bank, which is this big thing now. So what would be the equivalent of that if we think about diasporas and communities of origin? How do we, make this big? And in particular, I think Abel mentioned this, you have indigenous, migrant, and frontline communities. So what is the big idea there? How do we do something big?
Great. Well, you provoked me with macro, because let me tell you, I started like master students at the University of Chicago. The Gothic architecture is bringing it all back. that it started completely as a micro. That study, I was an activist. I became eventually an academic because I was an activist in working with the indigenous communities of Oaxaca, where the forests were being literally torn down, right? Before climate change, they were to be destroyed. By the first ever World Bank investment outside of Europe was Mexico to build a dam, and they were going to cut the forest to build paper so that the state could control the media. All right, and the Zapotec indigenous people that I've worked with now for 50 years, and they happen to be of my family, related, is we were stopping it. We were going to stop the World Bank destroying the forest, but then take it back under the control of the indigenous people, which we actually did unbelievably. We were successful in doing that, but then became a process, a long process of, well, how are we going to build it back? So at that point, migration had already begun, and remittances were coming back. And what we actually helped do with the community is to do a very different path, which is to build a community indigenous bank, all right? Whereby the people that left and the remittances were able to come back and actually be able to be saved locally with local savings, and then create a sustainable process. And at that point, now that mountainside, by the way, happens to be one of the most important examples in the world of sustainable forestry, all right? The Sierra Juarez example. So it was actually there that took me to write a dissertation where I said, oh, all right, so this is fine at the micro level. I'm still there. I took my students there 6 months ago. We're still totally involved because that's how I got to LA, following that migration path to LA. But how do we make it generalizable? So there was this concept at that time of the North American Free Trade Agreement, right? Where I studied and said all these different examples. At that point, I was a macroeconomist as well as an anthropologist, and said, okay, how do we make an institutional framework where we can make sure the flow of remittances, if you're going to do this grandiose concept of remittances, you're not going to do it through Western Union. You're not going to do it through cash transfers. You need to be able to create the real capacity of the community to have resources, control it, and apply their knowledge, critical knowledge, and direct the forces. So I created this idea of a development bank, actually sort of founded on European regional development funds, to do both environmental infrastructure. Back then, 30 years ago, was like brand new, and we did it, and we created this component of it for remittances. Okay, and I was like, what? I remember Bill Clinton saying, "What the hell are you doing this? What for?" Okay, I understand we need this infrastructure. What are remittances going to do? It was very hard to convince anybody in Washington back then, and in fact, the bank eventually got created. It's done, over 10 billion in environmental infrastructure, but did nothing on the remittance side. That required going out and actually building from the ground up the capacity of changing an industry of how remittances can actually make a difference. So fast forward right now, where we are is that Mexico is the largest bilateral remittance anywhere in the world. 60-70 billion dollars in remittances right now. It is by definition going to the indigenous and migrant sending communities and connecting them to the frontline communities where the environmental impacts are occurring on the north. Right? So it is an example. It continues to be this example of how environmental change is now transformed both north and south, and engaged in a process which we need to take seriously, and we need to transform on both sides of the border. If you look at where we're at now between U.S. and Mexico, we are unfortunately, and I'm now doing US Mexico in a global comparative example, different parts of the world, Africa. I just got back from Yunnan, very interesting, China, which turns out to be the most advanced example of actually migration from indigenous communities with remittances actually being financially reinvested in sustainable development. Mexico, it happens to be the worst case still. We are still cash. 90% of all the remittances come in cash. That creates a vicious cycle. It is not able to be transformed into long-term investment like we did in the Sierra Juarez. This is still stands out. We've created a network of 180 community development banks, but now, and I literally flew in from Mexico City for this meeting, there's a new president who's about to be elected. She's 30% up in the polls. Her name is Dr. Claudia Sheinbaum. I mean, a Jewish white woman becoming the president of Mexico. Yeah, it's about to happen. And very progressive. She's an environmental scientist. And the project here is to take this a community-run, owned network of development banks, of credit unions owning their own development banks. So I'm no longer building development banks for Washington to control. I'm building development banks owned by the networks of the of indigenous-run credit unions, right? And that way, that's the critical issue. I'll say that, and I'll talk about what this means on a global scale in a minute, but what we really need to think about is the transforming of these now $700 billion in remittances right now. The next 10 years, we're talking $1 trillion to the developing world. Are they going to go in the cash mechanism, which actually is not going to solve the problem? It's going to have a bunch of half-built attempts, okay? Or is it going to be a much more serious attempt, you know, again, in other parts of the world we can point to, where the flow is really about green. It's not some rhetorical discussion. It's going to take hard work, but it's going to take grassroots micro. You got to do the micros, everybody, but you got to stick with it forever. And you need to understand how the macro institutional transformations have to occur in order to achieve these goals.
Perfect, thank you. I mean, two very interesting things about that. I mean, the idea, and this is very important, that some of these communities that are affected by climate change, and when people go abroad, when they are abroad in communities that are also affected by climate change. So they're affected on both sides in the destination and sending a destination country. And of course, you know, remittances playing a big role. I keep pushing my case of green bonds, in the sense that remittances obviously is the income that migrants are sending back home. But when you talk about bonds, you touch on the wealth that otherwise they might have kept, you know, in the destination country. So it's even bigger, even the 700 billion. Yvonne, let me go back to you. By the way, you can talk to each other as much as you want to. I don't want to do a Q&A kind of thing only. Raul is very much focused on these credit unions, right? These financial institutions, right? And I think that's a very important way of having that impact. But something that we know is that diasporas have a lot of political powers, a lot of political power in destination countries, a lot of political power in countries of origin. So how are diasporas using that political power to address climate change issues? Or potentially, if they are not, how could they use it in some cases?
No, so it's really interesting that, you know, we're recognizing now that they have a lot of political power. And it's really funny because I was talking to the director of the RSC, Tom Scott Smith, and he says a question they always get asked is, why are there so many migration institutes and refugee institutes at Oxford, right? And it's because migration is a big deal, right? Migrants are a big deal. $1 trillion in money is a big deal, right? So that's why we're interested in it. However, it is an interesting conversation to have, because Raul, even as you say this, that these are still people. This $1 trillion is fascinating, but they're still people and households and families and households' needs, right? Imagine your individual income is being asked to contribute to a greater good. That's hard. That's really hard to convince somebody, to say a factory worker, $15 minimum wage in Canada,
Yeah.
working every day.
They call it taxation. That's something. What country is taxation? Yeah.
Right. And you're being told, and you're being advertised these green bonds, this guy's coming over to your factory all the time, right? Nobody likes him, right? And you're being told that you need to do this for the greater good. It's very challenging, right? When you get down to, because the same thing was happening in the Philippines, right? People were being asked, after a disaster, your home has been destroyed, you have evacuated, you don't know, you're living in like shanty homes. Like I visit them, and they're horrible. They're these little shacks, and there's a whole family of like 5, 6 living inside. It's very hot, right? And you're being asked the money that you get sent from your husband, from your parents, to get you out of this and into a proper house. No, don't do that. Put it towards a community. Think long term. Think of your children, right? That's really hard sell. It's really hard sell.
Let me, okay. Can
Let's go.
You mean your
All
microphone?
of you, how many people have a bank account in this room? All right, everybody. Okay, guess what? You don't have control of what's going on with your bank money this minute. They're using it and they're investing it in something. Okay, whether you like it or not. You have that because you're part of a banking system. Okay, the problem with immigrants is that they're excluded from banking systems. They're forced to live in a cash environment. All right, that's what we call and it generates what we call the vicious cycle. So because actually when you're all getting it in cash, it's extremely difficult to save and very difficult to turn any of that saving into investment. So that's why these institutions that really can deliver an incredible need. Immigrants are the smartest savers in the planet, as poor people are in general. They could teach rich people how to save, all right? And also, if you have the institutions, to create them into sustainable development bonds. So we've been doing bonds in these villages now for decades, right? In the form of this savings that's actually then and converted into sustainable strategies. Now, the question is scaling of this thing. So it's not a matter of like going and asking immigrants to contribute, hey, you solve the problem, they're your family. No, the issue here now is, first of all, you have to understand, it's not just the $1 trillion in remittances. You're absolutely right. That's only a drop of the bucket of the diaspora, right? All of the migrants together in the rich countries of the world, in Canada, here in UK. If you add up all the diaspora GDP, right, it's the 3rd largest economy in the world. There's the US, there's China, and then there's the diasporas, okay? Double, about $7.8 trillion, double the size of Germany and Japan, okay? So then it's here. The wealth is already here, and a lot of it is banked here, but it doesn't go into remittances in a bank way. Now, what we're working on now is, in different parts of the world, creating mechanisms, first of all, so that the remittances do go digitally and for free, not 10% in the Western Union, that directly go into institutions that can then capture the money in savings, just like they do here, right? We're not grabbing, grandma's money. No, we're helping people save, which is what they want to do anyway, and we're reinvesting that at very good rates of return and coming back. So that means there is an investable strategy of working with diaspora here, give them a rate of return in a bond, and then taking it home with savings back home and investing it, of which there's a great deal of investable strategies for saving the planet, all right? As we save nature, we're investing in nature, and there's a huge new movement on social returns. I see Dominique Kuhn in the background, one of the people I'm working with, creating institutions on a global scale that allow this capacity for converting this massive flow of now diaspora, not only remittances, but also diaspora savings. The other thing that's happening is a lot of diasporas eventually want to go back. And they want to invest back. They get it, all right? They get that Africa is a big part. In fact, the future of Africa is going to be because of diaspora savings going back, all right? El Salvador, just one example, the diaspora in the United States is 3 times bigger than the entire economy of El Salvador. Today, the future of most of these countries is because they're going to create a bond. You asked about politics, all right? The president of El Salvador just got massively reelected. Well, anyway, that's another story. But it was because also because they now established the direct voting, all right? From
That they asked
Los Angeles, you can vote.
Let me interject. So it's really funny that you got upset. I called you the macro guy. Because now you're talking about diaspora. Diaspora. Chinese people don't even like the Chinese people. I'm serious. I am a mainlander. Who's from mainland China? And when I immigrated to Toronto, Scarborough, an ethnic enclave, 6-year-old me, I was told by a Hong Konger neighbor that I could not enter her house. You're laughing, but I'm 6 years old. I can't enter her house because I'm a mainlander. Because mainlanders are, and we are uncultured. Now this mainlander is at Oxford.
Right.
But I tell this story because there's inter-ethnic discrimination. There's inter-ethnic violence and hate. And again, some Hong Konger felt the need to tell a 6-year-old who was new to Canada that she was dirty. And she made me wash my hands. And she made me wash my feet before I could enter her house and play with her kid, who looks exactly the same as me. Right? So bring it back down and get around like the diaspora. They're not homogeneous. Right? So how are we ever going to group them all together and save the world? This is actually a unifying force. This is a unifying force. Right.
So, but I think that, I get it, see, but the good news is we don't have to solve all the intra-diasporic issues necessarily when we're addressing now the fact that, I mean, you bring up the fact of China. I mean, the reality of it is that people don't remember that a huge part of the 20th century and 19th century China was built on diaspora remittances being sent back. And back to their particular villages. Yes, there is this tie you're going to send back to where you originally were. But now we're at a different level. Okay, the amount of remittances that are going back, and for example, from Africa into the savings from African diasporas in the United States now are going to become the most important mechanism for foreign investment, much more than all the multinationals combined. And that's already the case in Latin America. All right, the diaspora are already investing. They are already sending money back. They're desperately looking for where to invest. Okay, and this is an immense opportunity, right? You know, I mean, we're working now with a bank in the largest bank in Africa called Equity Bank. I don't know any people know Equity Bank, but you know that, by the way, grew out of a credit union experience and created a central mechanism and has a capillary structure because that's what you need. We you know, I think what we need to think about and I think the diasporas as a political force are increasingly becoming very sophisticated. This is why we're building this indigenous migrant frontline communities alliances as a political force that can analyze the global macro, but also have an ability to then provide real tangible micro products and results and institutions, you know, that.
No, so I agree with you there. I think one area where there is not much criticism is the use of the diaspora to place social and political pressure on countries, especially wealthy countries and their countries back home, to take climate action. So in 2013, when Typhoon Haiyan struck, Ambassador Sano of the Philippines was in COP19 in Warsaw. You know, and there's all over the news, people are evacuating, so many people have died, right? And he stood up and he said, we need to refuse to live dangerously. What a powerful statement. You refuse that climate change is going to cause all of this to happen. We need to refuse the normalization of super typhoons, of evacuations, of deaths. And he went on a hunger strike during COP19, right? To ask for real action. And he can do that because he was outside. So the diaspora can play that role, when they're outside the country, when they're not going to get targeted, especially with the countries with a lot of oppression, right? They have more of a voice. So most people agree on that, right? That they should use their voice and, pass these social remittances back home, right? In a way that could be safe and practiced.
I will stop you both because we have a few more questions. I want to leave time for the people. One thing to say in defense on getting diaspora bonds is that, one of the problems with bonds of countries, let's say Ethiopia, is issuing bonds, is the risk that they're going to default, right? And especially that they will, because it's in local currency. What happens, if it is denominated, they end up paying local currency. One of the things that I like about diaspora bonds is that diasporas a lot of times have debt that is in local currency. That's less of a problem. So they're less exposed to exchange rate change. But conversation, I tell you that there are limitations to diaspora bond. I wanted to, in fact, something related to that, maybe the last question before we open it to the public, to talk about COP and COP28, if was in Dubai, but I guess in general, more this idea, right, of COP in general, and how do we insert this conversation of indigenous migrants and frontline communities into that discussion, and how do we make an argument there for support from different governments? Raul, you were there, the last one, so you having going to the Sphinx forever. Yeah, so perhaps you can tell us how to do that, and then maybe one that you can react to.
Thank you, Carlos, for that. I mean, look, what we're, as I said, what we're doing macro and micro analytics from the university and basically forcing an agenda onto the world stage. And I highly recommend people go to the COPs. They're a fascinating place that's now been created, and they can't stop it. All right, you've got to talk about climate and the future of the climate. And it's very difficult to keep people out in many of these places. And 2 years is Brazil. Make your plans, okay? It's confusing. Meanwhile, okay, as they say. What we said is that look, if you look at the world, there's 500 million indigenous people, right? Identified as indigenous. They are 85% of the biodiversity of the planet is basically being safeguarded by the indigenous people. Another more or less about 680 million foreign-born in the world right now, living outside. Okay, and another 1.5 billion altogether. It's almost a third of the world's population is involved in this indigenous migrant frontline community dynamics, one way or another, with this massive potential for wealth generation in the United States. Oh, newsflash, I'm going to be on the US Senate in a couple of weeks. This crisis on the border of the migrants coming, guess what? It's a $7 trillion gift to the US economy that people want to show up, okay? The future of the world is going to require a lot more migrants and refugees, okay? It's not a problem, it's the solution, everybody, all right? And we need to understand that and focus it and put the attention on that. And just like a lot of other global climate transformations that have to occur, one of the critical transformations that has to occur is how migration and remittances are going to play a critical role in that. So this is what we're pushing with the COP agenda. And by the way, the research that you and Professor Alexander and Abed Van Israel, we're trying to create a hopefully all of you a network of scholars, California, because we're in Venice Beach and we're a little wild over there, and working with you guys at Oxford. You guys, you keep this part of the world, we'll get that one. We work together. So what we need to think about is, how does this agenda actually turn into an investable strategy? Well, if you think about it, right now, COP, at least they finally got it. It's quite interesting. If we're going to survive existence on the planet, we have to spend $240 trillion on redoing our entire energy system. We got that, okay? And that, and obviously we got to go down to zero emissions and all of that stuff in the next 30 years. At the same time, there's another crisis called biodiversity crisis that we, even if you drive your EV, it ain't gonna solve the biodiversity crisis, okay? We're gonna need to intervene now and radically now. The estimate is 700 billion per year. We're only doing about 166 right now. All right, how do we close those gaps? Well, it turns out that the remittances are already going directly back to those communities in the indigenous zones and into the migrant descending zones. We better solve this problem of how we convert this flow into an investable strategy that's controlled with indigenous knowledge in partnership with a global strategy, right? That's a challenge. So we are trying to create institutions, and the interesting thing is this is not charity. This is not, oh, come, let's have a bake sale for climate change. No, this is how do we direct investable resources into nature. Nature gives immense wealth of return, right? What's the value of a whale? Everybody know this strategy? Knows this answer? What is a whale? What is the value of a whale? Well, if you kill it, it's $40,000 in blubber and stuff, right? IMF, Ralph Chami has studied, you're getting it all wrong. The value of a whale is keeping it alive. And its ability to transform krill into shit, into more capacity to absorb climate carbon into the oceans, it's $2 billion per whale. So nature has value. Investing in nature has value. There's a whole new strategy going to be of biodiversity bonds. Okay, so this is the next thing we need to invest in. All right, and there's a lot of already, believe it or not, philanthropists and capitalists that are going to invest in this already. The remittances are a huge potential because in a sense, migrants are already investing in this. If we increase their capacity to do it, and they are the agents, they are the partners of the world that need to be on this front line. So, that's the agenda that we're trying to push.
Perfect. Yvonne, last word?
I don't know what parties Raul goes to at COPs. But they're wild.
I've never heard of that.
Oh, but I never said the word wild. I went to COP 15 and I cried every day. As a young person, it sounds better, but as a young person, when you're told that Copenhagen is Copenhagen and Obama is going to come save the climate and it doesn't happen, you cry. And a bunch of my friends that also went with me cried, and then they were depressed. Because, you see politicians performing their speeches. We would show up with negotiations and tactics every day, and we'd sit in front of the minister in Canada, and that's his job, and he would just bounce back everything we say. She's like, no, we can't do that. No, we can't do that. And we know that that's what all the countries are doing. They're not going to COPs to negotiate, right? So.
Well, I'm not, look, I am not Pollyannish. Okay.
I think this controversy is a great place to stop and get some questions. Let's give a round of applause to our speaker.